All right, so it's a inverted ground plane antenna. Now, we all know what a ground plane is, but this ground plane is different in that it gives you a gain over a typical ground plane. Roger?
QSL, a typical ground plane is straight in her origin and a lot of times used more as an impedance matcher than an actual physical radiating portion of the antenna. You know, a lot of times it's just a negative ground hanging out there, not energized, not, not radiating signal off of it, but attracting, being a negative counterpoise for the positive one that is thrown off. But in a 5/8 wave configuration or whatever, there is energy on the ground radials in this, for instance, because I've been lit up by them before, so I'm positive that there is energy on it. You can configure ground planes that have energy on them. So anyway, if there's energy on them, now that shape could be focused. I mean, it doesn't have to, it wouldn't have to remain a straight piece of metal, you know, going out at a whatever degree angle that it does, usually 90 or 45. You know, when one thinks of the old Antron 99 ground planes coming down at a 45-degree angle, or some of the old metal 5/8 wave antennas coming out, you know, at a 90-degree angle, straight, you know, horizontal.
Roger, Roger. So, and then you mentioned something about rhombic ground radios. Now, a lot of people don't even know what a rhombic antenna is, but this is an antenna that usually stretches over a few acres of land, maybe not tremendously high, maybe about 18, 20 feet high on telephone poles, stretching for acres, and it has a very directional characteristic, usually at medium wave or short waves, and they used them during the war to get from point to point, one country to another country, with really good gain factors. So, Billy, you have referred to your ground radios as rhombic radios. Is that a Roger?
Yes, sir. QSL, affirmative. And I'm glad you mentioned the ships, because that's come into play, because that was what spawned the invention. In articles of how to take a piece of wire and then a non-conductive string and make a ground radial or a ground plane out of it, and also a guide wire that would help hold up your mast, or be able to support. Well, in my, for instance, I couldn't run my string. You know, I could run my quarter wave of metal or wire, speaker wire in this, for instance, and then a string on out. I couldn't run that string into my neighbor's yard. I remember reading somewhere that ships support their mast by making that crossbar or a plus and coming back down to their self. So I took a plus sign, you know, made a plus or a cross sign out of wood, you know, and this was for the 10-meter band, which, you know, was, I'm going to say, approximately 35 inches in length both ways. And then I run that wire that comes down and would have been supported by a string around the end of that wood and back down to the mast pipe. Tied the end of that one to the end of the one coming from the other side with a shoestring so it was non-conductive, and then put a turnbuckle on it with a clamp to the mast pipe to pull the whole arrangement tight and taut. And there was born the INVI, the inverted ground plane system.
Right. Now, this wasn't actually on a ship, Roger. It wasn't on a real boat, Roger.
Correct. It was in my backyard in the desert, in the Mojave Desert out in California. It was anything but on a ship. But you see in a lot of old pictures and movies and stuff that, and in literature that they'd make their antennas, and they couldn't run their antennas, their inverted V, out at an angle out into the ocean, so they would do the same thing, go over a non-conductive piece of metal or non-conductive piece of something and come back in, making those V antennas you see on a ship. Okay? Well, and that was later found out, not in the original design. The original design was I couldn't run my string into my neighbor's yard. And so is that it wouldn't cancel itself out. I looked at it, I said, well, what signal goes from here, goes there, whatever, and And I said, so that it doesn't cancel itself out, I'll make the bottom one a little bit shorter than the one on the other side. You know what I'm saying? So, and then I'll let it reset and then get into the math on how that actually made what is, you know, what I found out later was a rhombic antenna made out of 2 quarter wave antennas. You know, which is, you know, I'll let it drop.
Roger, Roger. Let me just check real quick here. But you're doing this at 10 meters. Is that a Roger?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. 10 meters and making the ground or counterpoise of a 5/8 wave antenna. You know, or an off-center fed.
Okay, we're having fading conditions on the channel at the moment. Billy, of course, is coming from 140 miles away, so when you're talking 140 miles on VHF, you're going to have some anomalies from time to time. Billy, you back in again?
To the down, that off-center fed dipole configuration makes those ground planes hot, and this was discovered after the fact is that if they're energized and you're throwing energy off of them, it could be in your benefit to direct that energy.
Roger, so when did you realize that your antenna had gain, that it actually had gain over a nominal 10-meter ground plane?
It was quick. I'm going to say the crucible of fire of 11 meter in the Southern California environment there. It was thrown right up against any other antenna that was in my neighborhood. There was antennas all over the place, man. And I put my little antenna up about 22 foot high and dusted their britches. I don't know how else to say it in a nice way, but I was coming out on top. When the signal reports came back, they come back to me. Thus set the quest of trying to figure out whether it was just in my head, because I had made this invention, this ideal this thing I'd put in the backyard. How come I was able to just, I mean, why was it performing better? Or was it performing better and it was just in my head? You know, it was really performing better, but I just, you know what I mean, I couldn't, you know, and that set off a quest of radio learning that is still going to this day.
Roger, and you actually, after you realized that you had quite a unique pony there, you did apply for a patent, and you do have a patent on this antenna, Roger?
It is patent pending, sir. Patent pending is as far as I made it on it. You know, I was young and not maybe responsible enough to complete to seal the deal, but one can look it up at the United States Patent and Trademark Office and all the documents there. U.S. Patent 2004-01-40944 space Alpha 1, or the inverted ground plane system. That was the publication number. Back from in 2003 whenever I filed on it. You know, it'd been so, before I filed the patent, I'd had it for several years. So the patent, I didn't immediately run out and file a patent because I wasn't in that place in my life, and I didn't know as much about antennas and didn't realize that there wasn't nothing else out there like it with that ground plane configuration, and there wasn't nothing out there that could radiate signal like it does.
Roger that. Now, I'm trying to get a picture of this, well, for a better term, a rhombic ground plane antenna. Say for 10 meters, you would have the typical vertical radiator, and the actual trick is in the ground radio part of that. Roger?
Sir, 4 ground radials that are a quarter wavelength in length, folded just past the center point, or not just past, but somewhat past the center. So you would take your quarter wave coming out at a 45-degree angle, your normal 45-degree that comes out. You would come down that 45-degree a little bit past halfway and fold it, or bend, however you want to call it, but turn it back inward at the mass pipe. And see, what I did was, at that corner, I just put a plus sign and run the wire out and around that wooden plus and back down to the bottom, and then tied it to the leg that come down the other side, because there's 4 of them in this configuration. I guess I should have specified that. That way you have an opposing one. One's on one side of the the north, south, east, west configuration, the four sides to it there, and forming what looks like an open-ended box. If you were to continue the bottom or to folded them right in the, say if you were to just went halfway, not past halfway, but if you would have just went halfway down and folded them in, it would have made a box underneath. It would have made a complete box. But by going farther than the center, past the center on down when you fold it in, it's not long enough to reach back in, which leaves it open-ended, which if laid down on the horizontal plane, not vertical plane, would make a quarter wave rhombic antenna resident for the frequency it was cut.
Roger. So as you fold this ground radio back towards the other side to the co-existing ground radio on the other side bent back, they're close to touching each other and becoming a folded ground radio or not?
Yes, yes. And if you were to take a quad antenna, it would be a not folded in the middle, and that the bend or the turn back is past the center. It makes the bottom too short to actually touch at the bottom. And that open-ended is actually what makes the rhombic shape, that being folded at or about the center.
Okay, again, atmospheric conditions playing a part in the communications this morning with Billy down in London, but he's describing his inverted ground plane antenna, which is relating to a rhombic in that there's more than meets the eye on the ground radio part because they're folded back under each other, and we're talking about gain, that this ground plane antenna design gives gain over a typical regular ground plane. Billy, I don't know if you're back with us, but if you are, what do you figure the ground plane gain is?
Let me let it drop.
You had dropped earlier, and I was kind of yapping about the antenna, Billy. But what I was asking is, what do you think the gain of this ground plane antenna, special ground plane antenna, is?
I'm not mastered enough in the art of gain factors to give an exact answer. My approximation would be a realistic 5.5 dB gain, between 5.5 and 5.9 would be a realistic real world. Now, if one were to go dBi or compare it like against the way that an Antron 99 does their dB gain factors or way, it would probably be a 12 dB gain antenna. If dBi, you know, it would have real big numbers over a half-wave dipole.
Roger, it'd be 180 decibels if you did it the way way they do it. But the interesting part is that this ground plane, by the fact that the ground radios are bent back at the halfway point back towards each other, actually occupies a smaller physical space. Roger?
Roger. And to start with, the whole antenna begins as a full wavelength long antenna, so it's an awfully imposing looking antenna. I mean, there's a lot of stick there, you know. So anyway, yeah. And back to the radiation signal. If you were to draw a line, make a straight line, draw another line intersecting it, draw circles on it, you end up with the lobes of transmit. I'm going to go out. Are you with me so far on this?
Oh, Roger. So are we looking at these lobes from the top?
Any orientation, whether you run that wire horizontal, vertical, you know, then you intersect it with another line, same length, you know, and that is barring it is resident to the frequency or fraction thereof. But anyway, intersect it with another line and draw your circles, and you end up with your lobes. There's only two lobes there. When you hold that ground plane out in a normal ground plane fashion at whatever degree, whether it's upward, straight out, downward hanging, one of those lobes is headed to space and is lost. One of them is coming back down into your ground wave and is beneficial.
Right, and thus therein lies the gain, Roger.
There's no gain in that. There's just a half goes up and half goes back. When you fold that wire and now start drawing your intersecting lines, you end up with 8 lobes. Well, I'm sorry, 4 lobes. Okay? Are you following me so far? When you take that straight wire, bend it in the center, making an L out of it. Making an L. And then well, not quite an L, but one side will be a little bit longer than the other by definition. But that's still okay because it's at or about the center. It will now radiate from the center of both halves. So when you intersect that, you now end up with 4 lobes of signal radiating. With me so far?
Right. As you're looking down towards from the top, looking at the lobes spreading out, 4 lobes in equal directions, Roger? Like stretching a balloon out 4 times.
I'm talking about, like if you take the wire and just go straight with it, and then intersect it to where it looks like a plus sign. Then you draw a circle around one of those pluses, and then one on the opposing side, and that's where your signal would be, a representation of the radiation of the signal.
All right, now, when you're talking about bending the radios, you're bending the radios back towards the where the center mast is, but under the center mast. So you're actually creating an elongated U. Is that a Roger?
One more time, sir. I'm sorry.
So when you bend your ground radio at the halfway point back, you're bending it back towards the center part of the antenna, so you're actually forming an elongated U kind of a thing, Roger?
No, there's a box underneath. If you were to look at it, it forms a box shape, because there's 4 of them, and one on each side, one opposing each other, and the 4 of them. Or a dead spider. It comes right back in. Or if you hold your arm straight out like you're at a 45-degree angle and bend your elbow back towards your hips. See how and if you keep your elbow straight out, your arm is a little bit shorter. Don't make it all the way back. Same way with the ground plane.
All right, atmospheric conditions again. Billy, you've got a copy. The point is, maybe we could get to be able to look at that on the Google that. That might be an interesting thing. If you could give us the name of the antenna, so we could maybe get a better picture of it by Googling and seeing an actual picture of it. Roger.
Roger. It's the inverted ground plane system.
Inverted ground plane system, and Google that and take a look at this unusual antenna. I have a new timer, so I try to keep us legal here. This is Kilo Charlie 9 Victor, Kilo Victor, and Billy, UID.
Kilo India 4, Foxtrot Romeo Juliet.
Roger. Okay, now we're legal. That's bad when you document things like this and find out, oh, well, you went 20 minutes without IDing. Well, anyway, so if you folks were to Google the folded inverted ground plane antenna, right? That's the correct nomenclature for it?
Inverted ground plane system, because it's not really an antenna, it's the ground plane shape that could be utilized on several different antenna configurations, but so that's really the ground plane portion. So it's an inverted ground plane system.
Roger, and just one question about that, the vertical radiator from that, is that a quarter wave or a full wave?
The vertical radiator is 5/8 of a wave, and then the lower portion, load ring included, ends up forming the 3/8 wave lower portion. Thus the full wave, off-center fed, 5/8 wave antenna.
All right, and now the other question was, as a kid, when you were developing this, were you really on 10 meters or were you on 11 meters?
On 11 meters, I wanted to whip my buddies bad, man. I wanted to outdo them so bad I couldn't stand it. And I didn't have an antenna, moved to a new location, went to trying to make my homebrew antenna that I read on how to make your homebrew 5/8 wave antenna, and I could not. I did not have enough area. I live right in an urban environment. And boy, that 5/8 wave really lit their antennas up, their TVs up around me, by the way. That increased ground wave really showed itself up in their television receivers. in hindsight, but yes, sir. I'll send you a link, and you could go ahead and you could put a link with it too for to find the documentation.
Roger, Roger. Billy was voted off the island for TVI. Roger.
Actually coined the term TVI monster because when they would come over to the house, man, they had green hair and everything, man. Their teeth bangs out like they was a monster attacking me.
Roger. Most interesting antenna. We'll have to check it out. The inverted ground plane system. Google it and see what you think. Billy, enjoyed it this morning, sir. Say three's down in London, and you have a real good day and a happy New Year, the day after New Year's.